It's always heartening when people don't want to be extracted from active and engaged conversations, but we also know that there are constraints on the timing for the day. Thank you for the good discussions, and we'd now like to again invite some tables to come up and share just a few things that have come up that you think might be particularly relevant for the entire group to hear today. And I wonder if I could start with table 13. You look like you were incredibly engaged in conversation.
Good afternoon. I'm from Portage College, which is in northern Alberta. My name is Nancy Broadbent. So we talked a lot about qualitative and anecdotal assessment, talking about where our grads are at, whether they're going on to further post-secondary or whether they're in jobs, and trying to get a sense of how the connection of the learning outcomes in the program either helped or got in the way of that process. But we did talk a lot as well about our own internal evaluation processes, whether those are internal or external audits, health checks, those kind of quality control. And we sort of talked a lot about whether the learning outcomes, we might ask a question of students, is their perception that the learning outcomes that were on the syllabus were actually followed and used? But then we sort of got stuck on what are some of the indirect measures that we might do to sort of validate that, because we do know that perceptual surveys can be challenging. There's many things that can influence perception. And I shared an example of earning capacity. So we ask a question of students and graduates in the graduate follow-up about how much did the program impact their earning capacity. And of course, when the economy was very hot in Alberta, everybody thought it was great. And now we're seeing the downward trend, but there may not have been anything that changed in the program to impact that. So that's kind of what we spent a lot of time talking about. I think most of us do when we answered the question about who we engage. Most of us are engaging employers, institutional analysis departments, obviously faculty chairs, deans, former students and existing students and accrediting bodies. So I think most of us are on those paths as well. So that was it for us. Thank you.
So we've moved from learning outcomes to earning outcomes. And the philosophers now will give us yearning outcomes, I think. Table 10.
So I'm Nancy Parker from Athabasca University. And at our table, we didn't actually have that many people who are directly involved with assessment of learning outcomes. But we did have some observations that we made around the different types of direct and indirect assessment techniques, and opportunities for whether or not you should be assessing everything, and whether that actually gets in the way of building the relationship with the students. And so there was some discussion around that. I did talk a little bit about our experience, which is that this is as much a data management problem at an institutional level as getting faculty buy-in. So how do we actually document the learning? And then I had my moral qualm of what I can see you doing in your learning management system, and just because I can see it doesn't mean I should necessarily be watching you in that space. And I think those are the highlights. Thanks.
Table 7.
Okay, so my name is Stephen Gascott. I'm a student from the University of Calgary. I'm actually the president of the Students' Union there as well. So we started at the bottom end and worked our way up. So starting with the third question, we ended up talking about confidentiality in the results from performing assessment and allowing for that trust between faculty members and their supervisors, or the trust between the students and the faculty members, both when it comes to formative feedback and summative feedback. So if you're using formative feedback for performance management, be clear about that. Set that expectation from the get-go so it's not surprising. Or if you're using summative feedback for that, also be clear with that so people know what they're being evaluated on, so it doesn't surprise in the end and it doesn't violate that trust. So be clear. We also talked about mandatory evaluations as an inhibiting step for proceeding forward to try and increase response rates. So there's examples where students say can't view their grades unless they perform a type of assessment, but there's also the contrary view in that it could also result in lower response values because they could be required to report that. So we talked about that as kind of a discussion, and then we also talked about electronic versus paper response rates for summative responses at the end of the semester, and we also talked about how time in class is the largest contributor to actually getting results with that. We also talked about several technological methods for formative feedback, like Top Hat Monocle and other means of collecting intermittent feedback to try and improve and try and understand how well students are performing in class. But also that in order to make sure that those learning outcomes are met, having the training and the expertise so you know how to use them properly. Because otherwise you may have a bad experience and may not want to return to utilize those types of technologies. We also talked about disconnected expectations between the K-12 system and post-secondary, and how students coming in may expect to be graded on things as opposed to having competencies or having certain outcomes met. So if you're using a rubric allowing for that room for creativity and accounting for that within the rubrics and evaluations you use, so you can reward students without providing a ceiling. So the students who put in the extra effort and put in the initiative so that they can perform really well have that chance to stand out and also have a chance to be recognized for it, versus just everybody kind of meeting the needs of the rubric without having that flexibility, especially in upper years where you're rewarded for that type of creativity. I think that's everything. Thank you.
Table 5.
Hi, I'm Heather Kitteringham. I'm the Dean of Academic Research and Development. I will not be returning to Table 5. Just kidding. It was my privilege to record and now to present to you. We had a great discussion, actually. We talked a lot about the need to have a diversity in assignments. We were able to take a look at an example from U of C of how they chart and map their assessments. So that was really interesting. And we also had a good discussion about Indigenous systems of knowledge and how to look at program learning outcomes from a holistic point of view. And we talked a lot about values. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Table 2.
Good afternoon. I'm Tim Heath from Red Deer College. We ranged quite broadly in our conversation, and we agreed upon a few things. We agreed that measuring complex skills is complex, muddy, and expensive. So that was an agreement. We felt that with respect to outcomes, the best way to stay oriented is to really emphasize that triad of what is it that a student can know, do, or be, if you care about embodiment, or know, do, and value. So that seems to be a way to stay oriented in this process. We also feel that that triad has to be contextualized. Know, do, be, know, do, value for what? Is it for policing? Is it for social work? Is it for humanities? Is it for social sciences? Is it for a natural science? What is the context? And we notice that there's a bit of a dynamic when you start talking that way. Outcomes can make you believe more in things like universal design. They can make you believe that there's a lingua franca in the academy. But on the other hand, as you start to contextualize areas of inquiry and areas of study, it's possible to feel that the silos start to come back again. Because if you're really looking for competency in knowing, doing, and being, sometimes the outcomes begin to get very tightly niched again, and we step back into that realm of extraordinary focus on disciplinary expertise. And we felt that there is a little bit of a tension built into learning outcomes and what it is that we hope for and what it is that we actually do in them. Our best effort to actually address question 2, which is what is the connection between preparing learning outcomes and assessing them, our short answer is the connection between those two is learning activities. That the learning activities are really what hold together outcomes and assessment. And a final agreement that we offered among our conversation was that assessment must validate outcomes, and that in that validation, you have to work with, however you want to describe it, a constituency, a set of stakeholders, a program advisory group, whomever it is that area of academic programming is serving, that's where that validation needs to occur. And so again, we are looking at some very specific examples. If, for example, the area of programming is policing, well, actually, it's not so much that a graduate, say, needs to know how to shoot, it's maybe what they really need to know is when not to shoot. And that the only way to assess that is to really work with policing agencies to help you set that connection between a learning outcome, a learning activity, and an assessment. So that's our group.
Table 1.
So I'm Steve Dew, I'm with the University of Alberta, and everything that any of the other tables said that was clever, we also talked about. We did, like Table 2, explore the connection between learning outcomes and assessment, and really felt that the two had to be linked, that as you're setting your learning outcome, you really had to be thinking about the assessment at the end of the day. And we made that connection through what's usually an indicator, a performance indicator, something that you're going to measure that indicates whether or not you've actually achieved that outcome. And we reiterated the acronym SMART for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely as a set of principles around how that indicator has to be structured in order to be able to be a valid indication of the achievement of the learning outcome. We thought that the design of the assessment is something that the curriculum committee really needs to wrestle with, that's something that they have to think about the implications and own the implications. We talked about whether or not it made sense to have an external member, such as a member of the teaching center, involved in that curriculum committee, and the pros of having that expertise brought to the table, and the cons of perhaps that group feeling policed, overlooked, or intruded upon. One of the key things we felt was that anytime we're looking at the reception of the role of assessment, that it's critical to emphasize the message of continuous improvement, that what we're trying to do really is put in place a process that gets better and better. It's not judging the individuals that are involved with it. We expand that thought just a little bit. Assessment involves a number of different players, and often what you're trying to assess is the program, but what you are explicitly doing is assessing individuals, i.e. the students, who themselves might feel threatened by that assessment, which is not necessarily of them, it's about the system that they're going through. And is similarly the instructors. So if you're doing an assessment in the 6th course in a sequence that's developing a particular learning outcome and the students aren't doing so well, the person who's instructing that 6th course really doesn't own all of the blame for that. It goes all the way back down the chain, but that person is going to feel exposed. So just the whole reception of the assessment has to be thought out carefully. We also had a discussion about how assessment in a bunch of individual courses does not necessarily equal an assessment of a program, and so some experiments are being done in terms of trying to make that argument. We felt that doing authentic assessment, we need to have opportunities to demonstrate the learning outcome in an authentic setting. We felt that was more likely or more easily done in applied or externally regulated fields, both more opportunities to do the assessment in an authentic fashion, but also greater acceptance of the fact that there is an outside influence on what is to be achieved. We talked briefly about assessing not courses, not programs, but actually entire institutions. And there were some complications in that in terms of the different kinds of institutions, the different kinds of scholarship that occurs at the different kinds of institutions, and the equivalency of the different kinds of certificates that come out of that. And finally, we also had a good discussion around cultural context, particularly when we're talking about tribal colleges, how the very concept, perhaps, of learning outcomes and assessment does not necessarily smoothly translate into that environment. Learning is a lifelong journey and doesn't necessarily present itself in the same discrete manners that we might think of in a more traditional or mainstream setting. So there's probably some more other things here, but I think my notes have degraded to the point that I better stop talking. Thank you.
Rich conversations. Thank you all, and thank you to the scribes for coming in, for writing down comments, and the speakers for presenting them.